The preliminary investigation report of Air India AI 171 has revealed some astonishing facts that have created a new mystery in the world of aviation. Who moved the fuel switches of both engines from the run position to the cut-off position just seconds before the crash? When both engines started to falter after the fuel was cut off, one pilot asked why the fuel had been cut off, to which the other pilot replied, "I didn't do it." What was the reason that at such a critical time of takeoff, not one, but both engine fuel switches were turned off? Were the switches faulty? Did the pilot do it intentionally, or was it the result of a malfunction? What do other similar incidents in history, where pilots intentionally committed suicide, have in common with AI 171? Today, we will try to understand this issue in depth. Welcome to yet another video on Facts Central. Viewers, the morning of June 12, 2020, was a routine day at Ahmedabad International Airport. The air was slightly warm and the sky was perfectly clear. Some aircraft were boarding passengers at the terminal, while others were in the taxi phase. On the runway, an aircraft was landing or taking off every 5 minutes. Amidst this crowd, an Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner was also standing, with tail number VT and beam and flight number AI171. This aircraft had arrived in Ahmedabad from Delhi just 2 hours earlier on the same day, operating as flight AI423, and was now ready to depart from Ahmedabad to London. No one knew that in a few moments, this Dreamliner would make headlines worldwide and leave a mystery in the world of aviation. In the cockpit was 56-year-old Captain Sumit Sabawal, whose total flying experience was reported to be 1,500 hours, of which 800 hours were on this very Boeing 787. The co-pilot, also known as the first officer, was 32-year-old Tayyipullah, whose total experience was 300 hours, and he had flown the Boeing 787 for a total of 120 hours. The report stated that both pilots passed a breathalyzer test approximately 1.5 hours before the flight and were found to be perfectly fit for the flight. The same aircraft, Vermont and B, had arrived in Ahmedabad from Delhi operating flight AI423. There was a minor technical issue on the previous flight, which an aircraft maintenance engineer had troubleshooted and cleared. Now, this aircraft was completely ready for its next flight. Flight AI171 had a total of 230 passengers. The investigation report stated that the aircraft was filled with 200 kilograms of fuel, and its takeoff weight was 400 kilograms, which is well within the normal range for a Boeing 787. There were no signs of hazardous materials on board. Everything was as usual. According to air traffic control tower recordings, after boarding at 1:13 p.m., the aircraft requested permission for pushback and startup from the terminal. At 1:33 p.m. and 45 seconds, ATC instructed the aircraft to line up on runway 23. At that time, the wind speed was 6 knots, or approximately 11 km/h. The weather was perfectly clear and visibility was recorded at 60 meters. This means everything was perfect for a normal takeoff. After receiving takeoff clearance at 1:37 p.m. and 37 seconds, the pilot advanced the thrust levers and began to accelerate. It should be noted that the takeoff on this flight was being performed by co-pilot Clive Kunda, while Captain Samir's role was only monitoring. According to enhanced airborne flight recorder data, the aircraft reached V1 speed at 1:38 p.m. and 33 seconds. This is a speed of 153 knots or 283 kilometers, after which aborting takeoff is no longer possible. 2 seconds later, VR speed was also achieved, which is 155 knots, and then at 1:38 p.m. and 39 seconds, the aircraft took off. Up to this point, everything that happened was normal. Even in CCTV footage, everything appears normal until liftoff. But what happened next changed everything. Approximately 3 seconds later, the aircraft also achieved a speed of 180 knots, meaning that the engines were still producing thrust up to 3 seconds after takeoff. With the help of the enhanced aircraft flight recorder, it was found that immediately afterward, the fuel cutoff switches for engine 1 and engine 2 changed from the run position to the cutoff position, one after another, with only a 1-second interval. The engine's fuel supply was now cut, and their N1 and N2 values rapidly dropped, meaning the engine's thrust rapidly decreased. In the cockpit voice recorder, which records all sounds in the cockpit. It was heard that at precisely this point, one pilot said, "Why did you cut the fuel switch?" And the other replied, "I didn't." The investigation team has not yet determined which pilot asked the question and which pilot responded. CCTV footage also showed the ram air turbine rat deploying immediately after liftoff. This is an emergency power source that automatically deploys when the engines shut down. This power is used to operate the aircraft's main electrical system. The deployment of the rat is a sign that something unusual had certainly occurred in the aircraft. The footage also showed the aircraft rapidly losing altitude, and EFR data also confirmed this, as both engines' N2 values at that time fell below their minimum idle speed. At 1:39 p.m. and 5 seconds, ATC recordings registered a Mayday distress signal. When ATC asked for the call sign, there was no response. At the same time, ATC saw the aircraft crash outside the airport boundary, and an emergency response was immediately activated. The aircraft, in line with runway 23, first collided with the chimney of an Army Medical Corps building 1, 600 meters away, and then with the PJ Medical College hostel. The entire debris was spread over an area approximately 10 feet long and 400 feet wide from the first impact point. This accident resulted in the loss of 12 crew members and 229 passengers, while 19 people on the ground were also victims of the accident. Only one passenger miraculously managed to survive by being naturally seated near an emergency exit. This 15-page preliminary investigation report details everything. For instance, after the crash, the flap handle assembly was found in the debris, positioned at 5 degrees, which is a normal takeoff flap setting. And this was also confirmed by EFR data. The landing gear lever was found in the down position, and the thrust levers, although heavily burnt, were in the forward position until the crash. The most important thing was that the fuel control switches were found in the run position. This means that before the crash, the pilots had turned the fuel switches back on. Now, these fuel switches are normally designed such that only a human can turn them on or off. A locking mechanism is provided on the left and right of both switches. The purpose of this locking mechanism is to prevent the switch from being accidentally turned on or off. Whenever the pilot needs to open the engine fuel, it requires the use of both hands. One hand pushes the lock and the other hand pulls the switch up or down. And this is the most surprising thing, because no one can turn a fuel switch on or off with just one hand, even if they wanted to. Now, if the pilots didn't turn off the switches, as heard in the cockpit voice recorder, they would ring. And if it happened accidentally, the question is how both switches were accidentally turned off, one after another. The investigation report also found that both fuel switches were turned off with a 1-second interval, which looks like a normal human intervention. Later, both switches were also turned back on, but by then, it was too late. According to the investigation report, there was an interval of approximately 10 seconds between the fuel cutoff and the restart of supply for engine 1, and approximately 14 seconds for engine 2. There was also evidence that both engines had just started to produce thrust again, but at that very moment, the crash occurred. Now, the biggest mystery here is that flight AI 171 was perfectly fine until it broke. Everything from the engines to the fuel filled in it was normal. The investigation team also took fuel samples from the fuel tanker used to refuel AI 171 and checked them in the lab, but no anomaly was found there either. If everything was perfect, then why were the fuel switches intentionally turned off, or was their locking mechanism faulty? The report also mentions another important thing. The FAA had issued a special airworthiness information bulletin in 2018, which mentioned the possibility of the fuel control switch locking feature disengaging. This means the risk of the fuel switch's locking feature coming off was certainly looming in the aviation industry. This bulletin, also known as SAIB, was issued based on complaints from operators of Boeing 737 airplanes, meaning that this problem had been reported earlier in some Boeing 737 aircraft. The fuel control switch design, which includes the locking feature, is similar across various Boeing airplane models, including part number 4 Terralators 8373D. And the same part was installed in the Air India Flight AI 171 aircraft, Vermont and The FAA had warned 7 years ago that some fuel control switches were installed in a disengaged lock screen. Air India skipped this inspection because it was not mandatory, but merely an advisory from the FAA. But on the other hand, if we assume that the aircraft's fuel switch locking mechanism was faulty and the switch accidentally turned off during takeoff, then how did such a big coincidence happen that both switches turned off one after another with a 1 second interval? And if the pilots did it themselves intentionally, there can only be one reason: suicide. But was it actually a suicide or not? In 2015, the co-pilot of Germanwings Flight 9525 locked the cockpit from the inside. When the captain went to use the bathroom, the cockpit voice recorder revealed that he intentionally crashed the plane into the Alps mountains. It was later found that the co-pilot had a history of poor mental health. In 2013, the captain of La Mozambique Flight 470 manually set the autopilot to 0 feet when the first officer was out of the cockpit. FDR data confirmed that he did this intentionally and the aircraft crashed. Similarly, in 1999, religious phrases were heard in the cockpit of Egyptair Flight 990 before it crashed. And after that, the aircraft went into a nose dive position. According to the Egyptian government, this action by the co-pilot was the result of a mechanical failure, while the FAA considered it a suicide mission. And in 1997, in Silkair Flight 185, the pilot first manually turned off the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, and then crashed the aircraft by putting it into a nose dive position. Considering these historical incidents, one thing was found common in all these suicidal missions: the pilot not responding to ATC. But in the case of Air India 171, as it is being portrayed as a suicidal mission on social media, it certainly doesn't seem to be the case, at least according to the investigation so far, because the pilot did turn the fuel switches back on at one point. If the intention was something else, they would not have been turned on. Secondly, both were well responsive, and 2 seconds before the crash, they also gave a mayday distress signal to ATC. And thirdly, a few seconds before the crash, the aircraft's nose was seen rising, and flight data also confirmed this, meaning they hoped that the engines would produce thrust again and the aircraft might climb back up. If this was done intentionally, then what was the point of keeping the elevators in the takeoff position? What is your opinion on this? Please let me know in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found this video informative. If you are new to the channel, then please make sure you like, subscribe and share this video as much as possible.